well, maybe we should get started. We've got 85 people here with us tonight, which is amazing. Thank you all for showing up. I'll just give a little background about me, and then Jesse and Kate and Eden can all do intros. But we, as a group kind of decided that this was something we felt was needed, just because so many folks are asking for resources and understanding, and there's so many newcomers to this conversation, and we feel it's really important that this work is not done by Black and POC folks because they've been carrying that weight for far too long. So we're just here. I think, I'm an artist, I'm an activist artist, I live in Detroit, and Kate and Jesse are both also artists. Eden, are you an artist? I'm not sure.
Everyone's an artist. But no, not formally.
Cool. But yeah, so yeah, we just decided, in our creative community, this is a lot of the type of work that we've all focused on. So we thought we'd come together and just see what people are grappling with. Jesse?
I'm Jesse Hazlett, and I'm an artist and activist, and I'm here to try to take some of the burden off of my POC community that is tired and exhausted from answering these types of questions. And that is my only intention, is to take the burden away from the communities that have expressed the need to have the burden taken away. And I am learning as I go, as always, that being anti-racist is a constant learning process. And I've been anti-racist my entire life, but I'm still learning at 42 years old. So we'll always be learning, and if you feel like there's no more learning to do, then you're wrong. You're doing it wrong.
Hey, my name is Kate DeCiccio. I am also an artist who's been working around the issues of race and whiteness, and how those things intersect with the police and prison for a while now. Like Ann and Jesse mentioned, I've been receiving a ton of messages from white people in my life who are interested in understanding kind of a little bit more about like what it looks like to be engaged in this moment. And to reiterate the things that they said, yeah, for a long time, I think that people of color have been asked to explain their experiences, so to prove to white people that racism is real. And I think that right now is a moment where we as white people, it's very much our responsibility to look into ourselves and see what the hell's going on with us, so that for so long we've been able to, fracture ourselves from our humanity in a way that while Black and brown people have been saying, look, this is what's going on, we've been able to act as though we don't notice, and have perpetuated systems that, maintain white supremacy and particularly perpetuate anti-Blackness and anti-indigeneity. So, this is a conversation that's not an educational conversation around like what racism is. White people can never understand that in a way that, Black and brown people do. We don't live in Black and brown bodies. This is a conversation around how is it that we as white people become detectives in our personal narratives to understand the ways that we have shown up in the world that have been violent, exploitive, transactional, and have created the situation that we're seeing right now. So it's a really exciting moment, I think, for all of us to really begin to have these conversations in really honest ways. But we want to be really clear about what this is and what this isn't.
Just briefly, hi, my name is Eden. I am also an activist and organizer based in Detroit. My role here is kind of just to field questions and I don't know, make sure that we're answering them as best as we can in terms of like logistics, also tech logistics. So I think if it's okay with everyone else, I can kind of, I see, also just to mention for attendees or audience members, your questions are like sent to us, but like the rest of the group can't see them if you use the Q&A function. If you use the chat, then folks are able to see that. So I just wanted to flag that for people. And what I'm seeing right now is quite a few questions about how to engage in conversations about like with people who are sort of existing in a conservative bubble or maybe even like a liberal bubble and are well-meaning, but are new to having conversations, especially about some more radical ideas like defunding police or abolishing prisons.
Anybody want to take a stab at that one?
I'm happy to start, yeah. Well, I think that the first thing is that I think that we have an inclination to be like, that person's the problem. And I think that the strongest thing that we can do in this moment is to really understand personally how we are the problem. And I think that when we can sit really confidently in understanding who it is that we are, what it is that we come from, how it is that we personally, right? One of the things that I think we all notice is like, I would say it's like white people want to talk about racism like this is a subject, right? This is racism, we're talking about it right here. Where racism is like actually a series of first person narratives that all of us are participating in all of the time. So, you know, in many ways, white people have weaponized knowledge and our intellectual relationship with a lot of things. Like, oh, I want to understand this, and so I have an intellectual relationship and I study the thing, but we're really uncomfortable putting our first person and recognizing like, I've perpetuated racism in these ways, or I have, you know, perpetuated anti-Blackness, or I, you know, shut down white voices, or I worked at a school where most of the kids were Black and brown and most of the teachers were white and I wasn't doing things to make, so I think that when we, like in all things, right, if we want to call people to vulnerable conversations, we need to be able to be vulnerable, and part of that is really being willing to see our own part and participate in like what's our commitment to make things right. So, you know, I hear you around, we all have people in our lives who, like, the conversation's really hard. And I think that one of the ways we can prime those conversations to be with each other is getting like really at home and being candid about how we're all fucking up. And that like, that person's not more of a problem than me. This person, like, we're all the problem. We're all working on this, and we all need to be vulnerable to each other in it.
Yeah, I seem to have a lot of experiences where people say like, oh, well, I'm not racist. And it's like, okay, well, how do we get people to understand that like they can't see it? They can't see how they perpetuate it. And I think that's, you know, how we all perpetuate it. And it's just, it's about like, when you come to them and you're like, but I perpetuate racist things in my life and I'm working to undo that, then they have the capacity to be like, oh, well, if she's like that, then maybe I am too. And then they can see themselves in that sort of like anti-racism like shift, right? Like, okay, well, if I am doing that, how do I choose to not do that? Or how do I recognize that I am doing it? But until you give people the space for them to also be vulnerable, it's like I get this often in like conservative and liberal conversations. It's just like, well, yeah, like you were saying earlier, they're the problem, but people aren't going to be willing to be vulnerable if you're not vulnerable with them first. Yeah. And I think we have to create a space where people feel comfortable to talk to each other, especially across the political spectrum and lines, because right now, like, that shit has been totally shut down. People are not able to hear each other. They have no interest in understanding the other perspective, or even have the capacity to in a lot of senses. So how do we, giving people the space to really like sit with it and not feel judged, until, I think judgment can be such a destructive mechanism in how we move people towards, being actively practicing anti-racism, but you kind of have to meet people where they are so that they can then like have the capacity to look at themselves.
Right. Which is also why we're here. Like, we're here so that people can fumble and we're amongst each other and we're not hurting other people.
I probably have a different relationship with how people come at me, because people approach women much differently than they do men. But in my experience, I do have people come at me, but mainly strangers, where they approach me as if I'm going to relate with them on racist ideals because I'm a white, like whatever looking dude. And so a lot of my interactions are just kind of like, well, no, fuck you. But, and also I think people might feel less able to be vulnerable with me because of whatever reasons. But what I found is like I've generally like had to like manipulate people into understanding things about racism. And like my work, I use metaphor, like I use animal metaphor to talk about like mass incarceration. And so everybody has like a different relationship with animals. And so they'll be attracted to this bull or this snake or this vulture. And I'll be like, oh, you like that? Well, that's actually about mass incarceration. And then that conversation has started because there's a bridge that like, there's just something that's relatable. And then I go from that relatable point into making a more like in-depth, like conversation about like the issue that I want to get into. So I'm like manipulating people into caring about mass incarceration or about police murder or whatever.
Well, yeah. Hopefully we don't have to manipulate people anymore. Hopefully people are at the table.
Well, some of these questions though, they're like, how do you talk to a conservative family member? And it's like, it's fucking rough, because like, I mean, some people, they don't want to let go of their racism because like they're so solidified in the comfort that it provides. And that is the majority of white America is gliding off of the comfort that white supremacy in this nation has like allowed for them, and we've got to like shake people up. We got to like, people need to be uncomfortable as we go through this.
Yeah, it's time for everybody to get comfortable with being uncomfortable, because folks have been uncomfortable for fucking hundreds of years, and white folks have like been okay, and things are just, our normal is what so many folks just never want to be a part of ever again. Right. We have to recognize that we need to shift into a new future. Sorry, go ahead, Kate.
And I think that also brings up something that, a lot of times the way white people respond when they're being held accountable for doing something that's racist is with a sense of defensiveness, mostly regarding around that like their intention wasn't racist, right? And, as we think about sort of what's the culture that we want to create so that this iteration of this point in history can be long lasting, and we're really developing a space of like sustainable, of like a climate where there can really be transformational change amongst people as they're coming to have an understanding about the ways that our whiteness has perpetuated so much violence. I would also really like us to think about how that when people are asking you to see that you've done something racist, or you're saying something racist or being racist in some kind of way, like what becomes possible when you think about that is like a real gesture of love and care. And that particularly people of color, because when a person of color tells you, hey, look, you did this thing and it was racist or it made me feel some kind of way, they're taking a huge risk in not knowing how you're going to respond. And so we need to embrace those moments as moments where people are really believing that we have the capacity to get it right. So I really want us to, there's some qualities of the ways white people have historically operated when we're being asked to see that we're being violent or anti-Black or racist. And one of those things is a real sense of defensiveness and feelings like that, like, well, if I didn't mean to be racist, then I shouldn't have to be responsible for the way I'm making people feel or the implications of that racism, which is absolutely incorrect. But let's think about moving that defensiveness to a sense of curiosity and real gratitude for the people who are showing us the way.
Yeah, and I think that when you recognize yourself going into a defensive mode, like understand that is the white supremacy and you holding on to a structure that you need to let go of. Like recognize that defensiveness as like instead of a sign of like, oh, I gotta like take care of myself, like think about like, no, you need to shed that. You need to look at that not as like, okay, I gotta fight for this. You gotta look at like, why am I feeling defensive in this moment? And then taking action and accountability, you know, and like be able to be accountable, because there's stuff that's been ingrained into us like our entire lives, all throughout our schooling. We've been manipulated and lied to make us feel like we're the ultimate good guys in everything that we've ever done. And it is systematic racism, like indoctrinated into all of us. And so we got to like look at these feelings like, oh, I'm holding on to this like for dear life. It's like, no, we got to shed all that shit or we're not going to be able to grow. Are we going to jump into question? Was that an answer to a question?
Yeah, maybe
Okay.
we're ready for a question.
Yeah, we should.
Can I ask, just for ease of this conversation, there is a question that came in the chat. Can you mentioned anti-racism, can you pick that apart from not being racist, just so we have some common language? Can we answer that?
So I think when a lot of people say like, I'm not racist, they're well-meaning folks that don't realize they're perpetuating racist ideologies and issues. To be anti-racist is to actively work to shed yourself of the racist indoctrinations and levels that we've just carried with us as society has perpetuated these things on us. So being racist is like a single moment, where being anti-racist is like an action that you continue perpetually for the rest of your life. Anti-racism is taking, showing up for people and saying things like when somebody else says something racist, you got to show up and say, hey, like check yourself, like it's about like dismantling all of that in all of your experiences, not just saying like, well, I don't have racist thoughts, so I must not be racist. I think anti-racism is an action versus the idea of racism as like a static, like Kate was saying, it's an object and we're going to talk about this object. Anti-racism is like a new mode of life.
Which is also really what we've been taught. Like we as white people largely have been taught that racism is like a very, very ugly thing. It's like the worst thing that you could be. The problem though is that what we're taught that racism is, most white people think that like as long as you're not using the N-word and lighting crosses on fire on people's front lawns, and like you're good. And and whiteness wants you to think that because it's really easy. Like, okay, so like great, I won't use the N-word and I won't drive around with a hood on. And then I'm cool. I don't have to worry about that like I'm racist. But what the way racism actually works, it's like it's that prejudice married with power, and it's baked into all the systems that we as white people rely on in our life to maneuver through the world. And those systems are built for us to think that, like, I'm doing great in school because I'm working hard. You know, like, we all want to believe that we're like nice, hardworking white people who have the things that we have because we worked for them. We don't want to see that the system has been designed for us to accumulate, you know, tremendous wealth on the backs of Black and brown people who have been marginalized generation after generation. And so, you know, engaging with anti-racism is to dead serious, honestly, look at the way that we have benefited in, you know, financial terms by largely, you know, incarcerating, killing, traumatizing, stealing from Black, brown, and Indigenous people. And we need to participate in dismantling the systems that have benefited us in those ways and really hurt people as a consequence.
We have a couple of questions kind of falling in line with employers and jobs. I'm going to read this one. It says, what are your suggestions / tools for beginning conversations with employers that, despite best intentions, continue to perpetuate white supremacist practices in nonprofits and think that diversity and inclusion training doesn't apply to them or to their organization?
It applies to every fucking human being, first of all. Like, if your organization is not choosing to do diversity and inclusion trainings, you might want to go send your energy somewhere else. I don't know. I mean, as employees, depending on your circumstances, I don't know how much power you have, but if your employers are not willing to do that work, consider how long you want to be giving them your creativity, your, you know, your organizational skills, or whatever skills you're sending to your organization. I feel like if they're not willing to do the work, wonder if you really want to participate in an organization that's not willing to do the work.
Yeah. And I think the other thing is diversity and inclusion in a lot of ways can be total optic bullshit. I think there's some other ways for us to measure, you know, if organizations are showing up in real ways. Some of those things, you know, a really simple tool is to look at who's in positions of power, who has what salary, what board, especially in nonprofits. Look at it, look at the administration, and see how much the nonprofit that you're working for values diversity and inclusion. And I would, you know, I would mirror that beside their mission statement, and then come to them and really say, you know, are we serving our mission the way that we claim that we are? Because it's hard to do that if, because a lot of times what happens is that nonprofits are serving populations of people, and the populations of people who they're serving are actually represented in positions of power within the organization. And that's something that, you know, you can talk to them about.
I'm a little militaristic when it comes to this type of shit because let's say if I worked for somebody that was racist and in denial about it, I would call them out, and then I would call them out publicly, and then I would probably write graffiti all over the front of their building, because we cannot enable anybody in any stance to be racist or to be a racist institution. And we also have to make sacrifices. I have dedicated my entire life to this cause, and I have lost a lot of like money. I've been living like a starving artist, like because of my decisions. But you have to make sacrifice for like institutional change to actually happen. And if you're not willing to make sacrifice, then you're not willing to be anti-racist, because anti-racism is going to take a lot of sacrifice, and it's going to be a hard road. But that hard road is nothing like I can't even imagine what it would be like to be a POC living in daily trauma of white supremacy. So we have to make strong actions to allow for actual change to happen. And that might mean quitting your job. That might mean calling out people in loud ways to make these changes happen. But that's my take.
Great.
I'm seeing two questions I think that can kind of go together. One is, how do you respond to a white person that says rioting doesn't work? It's not the way to deal with issues. And I think like thematically that kind of goes with this other question about the discussion of anti-capitalism and anti-racism. How do you see the two as related? Are there books or other resources that you can point to that discuss how capitalism promotes racism? If anybody wants to speak to those two questions.
I will just say quickly, I threw in the chat a Google Doc that Kate shared with me a couple of days ago that has tons of resources. There's books, there's articles, there's people to follow. There are several other things. Kate, you could maybe speak more to that, I think. But there's a lot of materials in there for you to like, there's stuff for like kids, how to teach your kids about anti-racism, so many different resources there. So that's in the chat. Just make sure you click on that before we close the chat, otherwise, or before we close the Zoom call, because otherwise you won't have access to it. But I think speaking to like the anti-capitalism, anti-racism thing, if you think about the police systems that are in this nation and how they're structured, they've literally been built, like the beginning of the police force was the slave patrols. So the structure in our policing systems in this nation is literally built because of slavery. It was meant to, keep people in line, and it was literally built to maintain wealth in the white communities. So that's where it started. That's the foundation. And then we skip forward a couple of hundred years and you see that those practices are still being perpetuated on a daily basis. There's about 3 people that get killed by police every day in this country. And, cops are basically in place to protect and serve, but a big part of what they're about, like at least that's what they say, right? But they protect and serve whom? What are they protecting? They're protecting property, they're protecting capital, they're protecting certain communities. They are not protecting majority Black and brown indigenous communities. They are obviously over-policing in those spaces. So when you look at sort of who benefits from the police and who doesn't, you can see a very clear line that draws right back to slavery from the very, very beginning.
Yeah, I think that people really need to understand that connection between policing and property. And that, like when we say police descends from slavery, that they were slave patrols, when we're talking about property, we need to think about that police have always been designed to defend the white property owning person, like the person's property. And that property in the beginning was people. And now, largely, the police operate to protect white property. And so when we're talking about like the ways in which the police aren't protecting and serving us because they're not protecting us as people, they're protecting us as property. To smash property is one of the ways that we're working to like interrupt that relationship with property. So, and actually Aaron Goggins, who is one of the founders of Black Lives Matter in DC, was recently talking about how, and when you think about the trauma that Black and brown people have been faced with, and that right now, people are in the street and they're protesting and face to face with some of the police officers who've killed their friends and family members, to think that all the people are doing are smashing buildings, and like, it's actually not an overreaction. It's an underreaction in many ways. So
Yeah.
So to think that like, oh, some Walgreens, I can't believe people are breaking Walgreens windows. What would you be breaking if over and over and over again in your family, cars that said protect and serve on them were driving around killing people that you care about? I'd be willing to guess that it's more than Walgreens property, because right now, what we see amongst white people, like white people are exercised right now. Why? It's like, for the first time in a very long time, white people actually feel like they've got some skin in the game. We're feeling vulnerable. We're unemployed. We're locked in our houses. We know people who are dying. So I think also it's a great moment for also to kind of do a temperature check on how right now we're like in week 12 of a little bit of vulnerability. And all of a sudden we're like, oh my God, all these systems need to come down. POC are in like year 450 of vulnerability.
Word.
So it's like, yeah, I have no sympathy for smashed Walgreens windows.
Yeah. And on that tip, like, I think that people should be getting praised for the restraint that they are showing.
Exactly.
Instead of like condemned for burning a couple of buildings, like, these have been mainly peaceful protests, but even like the most wild stuff that has happened, it doesn't compare to the loss of a life, the loss of like George Floyd, all of the names throughout the last, I mean, there's more names than we could ever even document, because the majority of them have not been documented, because it happens when there's not a camera phone around. And this has been happening since like this country started. So there are countless names that have been lost to this racist system, and we aren't killing anybody. We are showing anger, but we're doing it with restraint, way more restraint than our police force has shown us. Even in the face of these police, and the police have just been showing us daily now, like how far they're willing to go to uphold white supremacy. They are beating us. They are driving their cars over us. Like at least 13 people have died. Fuck that. Like, we are showing restraint. And about like, what does rioting do? Every civil right action and movement has started with a fucking riot. And like, gay rights started with a riot. The last civil rights actions, they all started with riots. Everything that we have to burn shit down for people to pay attention.
They're working right now.
Say that again? They're
working really well right now.
Yeah.
So like, yeah. Honestly,
I'm going to share a link that from Trevor Noah did a whole discussion about the looting and the destruction of property and what that means in a society. That I think his argument was basically, which I found to be really clear and concise. So if you've got family members that are like, but they're looting and they're rioting and they're destroying property, watch the link and then send it to them. But this link is really powerful because he basically explains like a society is a group of people who all believe in the same law, the same rules. And when those rules are broken perpetually over and over and over again, you realize that the rules are not for you, they're for another group of people because you don't belong there. And so then when you break the rules and they respond like, oh my God, the looting and the rioting, that's us, white folks, suddenly understanding that the rules of the society are being broken by somebody else, and people are having such negative responses to that. When, if you think about white supremacy and how it's structured into our societal norms, like those abuses are so much more significant and they're so much more perpetuated over and over and over again for hundreds of years. Like white folks are just getting a fucking tiny taste, a tiny sliver of understanding of what happens when society doesn't uphold the rules that we think are appropriate. Black and brown folks are watching their fucking family members die and people are pissed because a building's on fire. Like, we have to recognize that this is so much deeper and bigger than anything that we've ever had to experience as white folks. And that's why we all really need to show up right now. And that's why we all need to really continuously do this work and like show up, because we have like no idea. We have such a small understanding of this. And like to what Kate was saying, like, yeah, we've been vulnerable for a couple of weeks and now we're out in the streets. So we need to stay vulnerable and we need to keep staying in the streets. We need to keep this energy and this momentum. It's so important. We are actually on the brink of supporting folks who really have been demanding this change for hundreds of years. We have more questions. Let's go to another question.
Yeah, kind of to go off of that, how to be supportive. There are quite a few questions. How can I be the most supportive to the Black community? Is posting resources the best way? I'm always worried that my actions will be seen as centering my experience again. Similarly to that, is a respectful way to show support? What is a respectful way to show support without being performative? I want to share resources that I'm learning from, but I also know it's not my voice that matters right now.
We discussed this a couple of hours ago when we were kind of chatting as a group, and we decided to share the resource list that Kate had because it wasn't ours. We didn't write it. It wasn't from a white perspective. And so I think it's important that we recognize, like, sure, we can share resources and that's great, but like, are you using the resources that are shared? Like, how do we have to show up educationally, we have to educate ourselves with this, but we also have to, like Kate was saying earlier, like have a personal emotional reckoning with how are we participating as individuals, right? So showing up for folks is important. Supporting Black businesses is huge. When we were organizing this webinar, I was like, oh, fuck, it's $150 to do this. And then I was like, you know what? That money can be far better spent given to a Black business or to a charity or jail reform or, bail funds or whatever. So Eden was awesome enough to like, be like, hey, I got something I can hook you up. Let me connect you with my Zoom thing. And I think it's really about like, how do you divest from these corporations in the space where like $160 is a drop in the bucket to Zoom, but it can really make a big difference to, a local bookseller or a local restaurant or that sort of thing. So, or, any of the other many funds that you'll find in that resource list. I think it's really about like, how do we spend our money? Money is an object or is a tool for us to use to sort of shift out of a lot of the systems that have just been in place and have been normalized. So really being aware of how you spend your money, I think, can also be a way that's not performative. Volunteering and supporting local groups is really important as well. Donations, educating your kids. I mean, that's probably the least performative thing you can do, and probably the most impactful thing you can do is really teach your kids anti-racism and teach them that this is this is something that they will need to be doing for the rest of their lives as well.
Yeah. I think there's also something, this is also a real opportunity to follow Black leadership, and that like, do we need to be showing up in the streets? Yes. Do we need to be at the front of the march? No. Should we ever be on the microphone? No. Should when there's opportunity and you have platform, how can you do a good job at making sure that, Black and Brown and Indigenous voices have that platform? So I think it's also really about thinking about how much space we take up. And that's something that you can be thinking about in all areas of your life. Like, am I the right person to be saying this, doing this? Yeah, all of that. Are you a person who, like, someone's interviewing you and asking you about, whatever, It's a chance to be like, hey, you know what? I'm not the right person to talk about this. This person who has firsthand experiences.
Yeah. I was thinking like, check your intention going into everything, because I think intention is so ego-based. So getting to know what your ego is drawing you to do, and if it's like inflating your ego, getting to know really, really internally, like, okay, is this my ego speaking, or is this like good intention? Intention is so important in every action that we do. as trying to be a good, better person. So check your intention. If it's feeding your ego, that's probably not a good thing to do. And that's when it becomes more performative and like you're not doing it for the right intention. I try to check my intention and my ego constantly. And it's a very, very healthy practice. And right now it's a time to elevate Black voices. So use your platform, whatever it is, to elevate other voices besides your own, you know. And go to the protests though, like feet on the ground. Like when I was in Standing Rock, there were teenagers there and there were senior citizens there. And on the most dangerous day, on the front line, there was a couple of senior citizens. One was Indigenous. She was about 4 feet tall, and she was like 70 years old, and her husband. And they were on the front line staring down the barrels of guns. And my job that day, I decided upon seeing them was like, I'm standing in front of those two so they don't get hurt, you know? But like, there's no reason to not go have your feet on the ground. You know, everybody does it, and it's time that we start doing it instead of relying on the POC community to do it for us.
I would say also, in addition to that, as an artist, I take this and you know, translate it to your line of work. But as an artist, going forward, anytime someone asks me to be in a show, I'm going to ask to see who the other artists are. And I'm going to ask to make sure that there is a cross section of people, and it's not just a bunch of white guys and I'm the one woman and there's nobody else. Like people of color, trans folks, like everybody, you gotta like represent, you gotta get like the actual perspective of what's happening here versus just the white male or the white perspective. So however that can translate into your line of work, you know, I think it's been far too long that, you know, these industries have just been white male dominated. And really, you know, I think going back to that earlier question about, you know, your racist boss or your racist institution, like how do you shift that? You know, I think it's about like making demands or just choosing to not participate. And then, you know, those organizations become weaker and weaker when people don't participate in their activities. And I think also going forward, like it would be very easy for artist organizations to just be like, or petitions and have artists just be like, yeah, I'm signing this. I'm not going to be in a show unless XYZ is part of, you know, the thought process and how this is being presented, because it's really easy to just be like, oh, I got an opportunity. Isn't that great? And not question why you got it. It's because people know who you are and maybe not because you're as good as somebody that they might not know. So it's also about like Jesse was saying, like amplifying, you know, Black and brown and Indigenous voices, like show up, you know, and give people the platform that you've just innately had because of your skin color.
Yeah,
right.
Share your platform.
And I think it's also an opportunity, you know, like a fundamental value within white supremacy is success within capitalism, right? And so I think also it's really important for us in all of those moments to be thinking about how is it that I've normalized earning money despite the ways that it's harming other people. And you know, in a book, I don't know if it's on there, but it's an amazing book. It's called Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. And she lays out an incredible, you know, argument to illustrate the ways that white people think about relationships as a means to capital. And it explains a lot about the way that we behave in relationship to other people and the earth. And she argues that, you know, people of color, they believe that the relationships are the capital. And so, you know, for us in doing part of our anti-racism work is to understand the ways that we've compartmentalized our sense of humanity so that in certain arenas of our lives, we're willing to do things, even though it's super harmful, if it's a path towards capital. And it's part of the interrogation that we need to do within ourselves.
There are a few questions about how to interact with Black friends or friends of color, in terms of like, can you ask like, is this offensive, or you know, should I wear this, and also questions about how to check in on Black friends right now, and do that with care.
Want me to take it?
Sure.
I think those kind of questions, if you're having to question them, they're probably offensive. And that's not the job of your POC friend to tell you that. You need to educate yourself upon these types of things. And if something is questionable in your dress, like I don't have a single thing in my wardrobe that is offensive, like, to, you know what I mean? Like, I don't have any questions about like if something I'm wearing. I support the homies, no colonizers. You know, I support POC companies. Everything I do is with intention, even my wardrobe. And I can speak from experience, like my experience with I mean, I don't know, like I guess it depends on your friendship. If you're a close friend, like, of course you should be checking in. I check in with all my friends. The majority of my friends are POC. My brother is Black. And I mean, I check in on them constantly. You know, this is a really hard time. But I also, I take a hint too. It's like if somebody like is expressing, you can read people if they need space, you know, and like I give space. I say that I'm there whenever they need me, and I stay true to that, you know.
Yeah, I think that you brought up a few things. One of those things is like, in the same way that we're in relationship with people all the time and checking in on them, like if it was just like you saw the systematized, like Vogue put out like 10 things to do in this moment, and one of them is check on your Black friends, if that's what cued you in that you should be checking on your Black friends, it's like it's gonna feel a little inauthentic this week. So likely, probably if you're in relationship with Black and Brown and Indigenous people, we're talking a lot anyways right now, because it's really stressful. And also, like, I think it's really important for us to like have a like some grace and some humility around like for example, okay, when we did this, we're like, it seems like people need this thing, let's do a Q&A. And then three of us were also like, getting together a bunch of white people in a room alone, like, it's not really a good idea historically. So let's talk to our community and see how they're feeling about it, right? And so I definitely texted a handful of people in my life and I was like, hey, this is what we're thinking about doing. You know, I really respect your feedback. If you've got anything like input, let me know. And also, if you're having like a fucked up week and you're just like, go away, deal with your white people, also tell me that. And, you know, we should be in relationship in a way where, you know, also we can own that like we're white people fumbling all along the way, and like we're not perfect all the time, like, you know. So I think that's fair. The other thing about like what you can wear, what you can and can't wear, I think it's also a moment to kind of, for us to kind of reflect on why it is that we're so hungry to consume cultural items of cultures that aren't ours. And it kind of, I think, comes back to this idea about how as a result of capitalism, in many ways, we don't have a relationship with cultural identity, and that capitalism has replaced that. And, you know, largely for white people, we cling on to these, I come from a place that fetishizes pilgrims. I don't know where you guys come from, but I come from a place that fetishizes pilgrims. And this year they're celebrating the 400-year anniversary of the Mayflower. And so, that's what people that I'm from cling on to in terms of like their
that's their identity.
Yeah, their ethnicity. But the truth is that there's a lot of lies about what that looked like, in Massachusetts public schools where I went to school. And we don't have a truthful sense of identity about who it is that we are and what it is that we come from. And I mean, personally, I say there's, that has created a tremendous void of identity, certainly for me, because I believe that like our bodies know the truth. Like we're not vulnerable to racism because we're feeling good inside. I mean, we're not vulnerable to capitalism because we're feeling good inside. We're vulnerable to capitalism because we're feeling empty inside, and we're searching for a sense of like identity and place in the world. So if you're seeing African textiles and you're like, oh my gosh, I want to be that and wear that, and that, it's a good chance for you to be like, what's going on with me? So I don't think you need to talk to your Black friends about it so much, but to just like, what's up with us?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think we should go on to the next question because I have nothing more to add to that. That's amazing.
So we are at 7:56 right now, just to note time. I thought this was a good ending question. How do we keep this going? How do we keep up momentum through more than just a news cycle?
That's, I think, why exactly we chose to do this. We obviously see there's a lot of interest in this, so I think we'll be continuing this type of conversation in the future. We're not quite sure what that looks like yet, but we're at a point in history where we can choose to push through with the momentum and affect real change in our society, or we can choose to be like, cool, I protested for a couple days, yeah, that was sweet. I posted the black square, and now I'm going to go back to posting pictures about my dog. We need to be mindful that this fight is going to continue, and without us all being there, we're not going to get there as fast as we need to. So we all need to just continue to show up, continue to be mindful. Like, I know it's been like a challenging week or two for a lot of people who are like new to this space. And I think, while I don't want to say you need to get comfortable, you need to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. I'm going to say it again, like, you need to also make space for this type of work in your life, which means you're going to have to let go of some of the Netflix or some of the, beers with your friends or doing whatever you do as like leisure time. You're going to need to sort of recompartmentalize your life and dedicate a portion of your time to showing up like this and doing the work and continuing the work and continuing to show up for that community. And that also means you also need to find space for self-care, because this is hard work. It's emotionally draining. And if you don't take care of yourself, you're no good to anybody. So you really need to also be aware of like how you're showing up, and if you don't have a lot of emotional energy, show up in a different way this week until you can get, whether that's like, buying takeout at a Black restaurant or doing something like that. But you need to make sure that you're constantly showing up some way. And I think you need to recognize that we will continue, we have to continue this work, which means we have to continuously show up. So figure out how, I say to myself, like, I get out of my comfort zone and then I take 2 or 3 more steps out of my comfort zone. Like, the white comfort zone is very real and it's very established. And I think we need to recognize that we all have to leave that shit behind and keep taking steps forward. So get out of your comfort zone, stay out of your comfort zone, but also recognize you're no
get
good.
on the streets, stay on the streets, because I wanted to actually, for this part of this answer, I wanted to quote from Michelle Alexander. Is that showing? It's not showing. So those who believe that the advocacy challenging mass incarceration can be successful without overturning the public consensus that gave rise to it are engaging in fanciful thinking, a form of denial. Isolated victories can be won, even a string of victories, but in the absence of a fundamental shift in public consciousness, the system as a whole will remain intact. So that I think this applies directly to what's happening right now with our police, because it's a part of the greater judicial system. And so we can't applaud a couple of prosecutions if they actually go through. We have to demand and not stay silent until there's fundamental change, like top to bottom in the whole judicial system, because this is a racist system and we can't be silent until it is all crumbled down, and then we build it up from our own foundation. And that's not gonna happen if like we just go back to posting like food photos and like not protesting. So stay on the streets, stay active, and stay vigilant.
Right. I agree. Black Lives Matter is not a summer activity. And I also think that a lot of times we as white people are looking for like the to-do list. You know, like what are the 10 things that I need to do now in this moment? And there are some 10 things that we all need to do that are like part of a checklist. But I think that the momentum actually, I really believe, lives in us doing the work that's going to provide for like deep transformational spiritual change that's going to make it so that it's actually impossible for us to be capable of operating in the world in a way that is as exploitive as we've normalized right now. So, you know, and I think that our tiredness in many ways comes from that, like our spirits get tired. Right now we've got major momentum and we're winning. So we need to do the things so that we continue to show up, we continue to give our money to movements led by Black and brown people, continue to be in the street, but also we need to do our homework so that we really know what the hell is going on with us, and we can get in there deep and do the healing work that's required, so that it's not a mystery about how it is that we got to like be upholding systems of violence and racism. And when we get right with ourselves in that kind of way, you're going to be feeling a hell of a lot better, and you're going to be feeling connected to the world in a way where you're no longer capable of, you know, being so transactional. We're going to be able to be in relationship and be working on behalf of Indigenous and Black liberation while simultaneously salvaging our humanity. Like the future, like I think that pre-formative stuff, that like taking down the police and ending prisons, it's not because the future is going to suck, it's because we want it to be good. So like that momentum of like, this is going to be good. We're not here to be martyrs. We're here because it can be so much fucking better. And Black and brown people have deserved it for way too fucking long and we haven't showed up, but it's going to be better for all of us.
Yeah.
That's a really good way to end.
Real quick, I don't know if this is, somebody asked a question, just real quick, I just wanted to say, somebody asked like about how they could like incorporate their Trump supporter friends into their group. Trump supporters are not anti-racist. If you are supportive of a racist person, then you're not anti-racist. You can't be on both sides of that. Like you're either for it or you're against it. Like Trump is the epitome of white supremacy, and he's not ashamed about it. So those type of people, that they need to have a fundamental shift. They need to do the work, and they need to check themselves. And they are not welcome in my protest. You know, it's like, you need to shed that shit before you come over here. That's what I think.
Speaking of the protests, I did add a link to the Black Lives Matter chapters around the country. So if you're thinking about donating to different groups, donating to your local chapter, it's going to make the movement in your town much stronger. So instead of, I mean, the national organization is great, and if you want to give them money, great. But if you really want to see change in your local community, give to those chapters. A lot of the map doesn't have a ton. I don't necessarily think it has all of them on there. So if you don't see your town, maybe just do a quick Google search. But blacklivesmatter.com is the actual movement. blacklivesmatter.org is some fake shit. So .com is the way to go. So Eden, I think, did we collect everybody's email address through the registration?
Yeah, we have access to everybody's email address, so we can send resources that way, and as well as the recording.
Yeah, I've seen a handful of people asking about how we talk about ending policing, and that a lot of people are scared about that because they think it's just going to be a free-for-all. I would say that a book that you definitely want to get is The End of Policing. It really lays out that it's going to be so much better. Like I was saying, it's going to be so much better.
And it's not going to be
it's going to be so much better.
Yeah. Oh, also, a good picture of that is Homage to Catalonia by George Orwell. He was a part of the Spanish Civil War, and during that war, they were in Spain, and the whole cities would be like ran by the anarchists, and it just, that sounds like the most beautiful like life, like just the picture that that group was able to establish in those times. It was just sounded amazing, way better than what we have going on now.
Yeah.
And then the new Jim Crow. Sorry, it's all weird.
Yeah.
Read the new Jim Crow. Mandatory.
So everyone on here, we believe in you. You're not going to leave that racist forever. Well, what do they say in recovery? Welcome to the first day of the rest of your life.
Huh.
Recovery from white supremacy. That's good.
Exactly. There's no Heimlich maneuver. It's not just one move. It's the rest of your life.
It's a workout. We'll think about how to do this next time and do another chat in 10 days a week, something like that. So you guys all get notified with your emails to our next moves, and we're really grateful that you took the time to show up today and keep showing up for people and keep doing the work, and let's change this country. Yeah, and any feedback is welcome, especially any POC feedback. Let us know how we could be of best assistance. Yes. Love you all. Thank you for having me. I'm very flattered to be among such badasses as yourselves. They're all to be here.
Yeah, thank you so much to everyone who's here. Let's keep away at this.
On the street.
All right. Bye, guys.
Bye.